Let's begin with a quote from Teilhard de Chardin. No older religious form or formulation can any longer satisfy to the full our need and capacity for worship. So true is this, that a religion of the future cannot fail to appear before long, a new mysticism. I believe these words, written in the mid-20th century by this French Jesuit paleontologist, are becoming a reality in this very time. Of course, that's what this series is all about, and I'm happy to contribute my voice and perspective with you all today. My name is Luke Healy, and I'm the co-founder of Integral Christian Network, along with Paul Smith, who you may know as the author of Integral Christianity and other works. He's a dear friend of mine and spiritual soulmate, someone I've learned a great deal from. Our network and community at this point is primarily focused on this new mysticism. Just like all healthy evolutions, it is hopefully taking the best of what has come before and integrating, creating the space and possibility for the emergence of the new in response to the deep needs of this time. Our work is focused on the religion of tomorrow in the specific context of Christianity. That is the setting and story that I grew up in and my native tongue, so to speak. We define Christianity not by its boundaries, a tribal, mythic, or postmodern tendency, but rather by its heart. All are welcome to receive from the healthy gifts, and we certainly are free to explore and learn from other traditions, incorporating the lessons, practices, and insights that are more developed or speak more directly to our own experience and serve us. We have chosen to focus specifically on Christianity, not just because it is our native tongue, but also because it is the common language of the Western world. It is in so many ways the ground from which we have all grown, with all its toxins and its nutrients. While the future may be drawing us to a more interspiritual or post-religious context, the vast majority of the world's population are still being brought up in the traditional religious systems that have existed for many centuries. And at its best, an integral religion of tomorrow will have to make use of the great conveyor belt of religion, as it has existed and served humanity so far. Though, of course, with the orientation toward development and evolution, to release the unhealthy and harmful aspects coming from each stage expression. In this sense, we're working on the religion of tomorrow, not perhaps the religion of the future. The distinction here is important because we can perhaps get a little ahead of ourselves at times. Casting forth a vision for the future is so important and necessary, but when we seek to apply these integral and futurist principles to real-life settings and communities as they are now, we need to keep an eye on the present as well, to see where to take the next necessary step. There's a saying in spiritual direction, where you're at is where I'll meet you. While this is true in the care of souls, it could also be a pretty good mantra for integral as well, at least at times. This is often to seek to span the gap between abstraction and reality, to be pioneers but also bridge builders. Some will lean more to one side than the other. I find myself often drawn to the pioneering side, to the dream of the possible and the future, visioning what transformations could come in response to all the injustice and abuse that exists now. I know I carry the shadow side of this as well, the impulse of escapism here in me. And so I try to remember where I've come from and stay present to the needs of the moment while also still dreaming. This is pioneering the next necessary step, practically creating what is missing, what needs to be integrated for healthier expression and healing. There's a line in Wilber's The Religion of Tomorrow that struck me perhaps more than any other in the book and has stayed with me because it resonated so much with my own experience. He says, knowing becomes not the given representation of an object by a subject, but a mutual resonance of all four quadrants vibrating together when truth is present, and failing to vibrate when falsity is present. Something in my being resonated with this truth, in part because of the longing that I felt in the midst of a religious life largely marked by the dissonant feeling of falsity. Not my own spiritual life, but my religious life in the context of Christianity and its systems and its collective atmospheres, especially in the we and the its. In short, a sort of intuition within myself, recognizing the arrested development in the lower half of the quadrant. at least in my own experience, and probably that of many others too. I think that's in part why so many have to leave, to venture forth into other religions and traditions to find what is lacking. This is perfectly okay. I have no desire to solidify any kind of walls of enclosure. That can be a very liberating experience, and I imagine it is the same for those brought up in other religions as well. All have their limitations and inadequacies. So we don't use the Christian identifier with any intention to bring anyone back in the fold, any wayward Christians who have wandered out. No, certainly not. I used to teach English language learning to people who had come to the United States from other countries around the world. I taught advanced English, focusing on the finer rules of grammar and at the same time the slang and colloquialisms of American culture. Anyone who has learned another language knows that there are the abstractions and there is the lived use of that language, and they are two pretty different things. Again, seeking to meet abstraction with the reality of lived experience. But usually, the very last thing that someone will do in another language is pray. Their heart always wants to return to their native tongues when they are praying. So much energy is often lost in the translating process, whether that be with language or with spirituality. Teilhard calls this tangential energy. If that's the path we have to take to discover what is most deeply necessary in our spirit, more life and energy will be found there for sure. But often the work of translation and learning a whole new system will take up so much of the time and energy of the individual. This is ultimately a horizontal movement, a searching for another well that might reach a little deeper or have nutrients not found in another. Again, if our well is run dry, we often need to go on this search and should be encouraged to do so. And then often at some point, there is a deep need that many people eventually have to return home, to come back to their roots and find healing from the shortcomings of their original tradition, just like we often have to do with our parents and our upbringing. Or there's often a desire to translate their new experiences into their foundational understandings. In this sense, this is the old story of digging one well deep rather than shallow wells in 100 places. Can we deepen our own well of Christian spirituality? Can we offer the liberation of the freedom to continue along in our native tongue, drawing from the gifts of other languages, but without everyone having to become polyglots? There may eventually come a day when that need is no longer, when we will find ourselves immersed in the rivers of living water. Some of us may already be there. But many are still sitting by their wells, lowering their buckets over and over again into the dregs of shallow religion, of shallow Christianity. Has that well run dry? Moving away from the metaphor before we overdo it, another way to say this is that we all have deep spiritual needs. Spiritual in the sense of the need to worship, as Teilhard put it. I myself have a little bit of an allergy around that word from my own upbringing in very traditional Christianity. But it communicates our deep thirst for something to live for meaning and purpose beyond our own individual ego stories and self-enclosed worlds. Some have the time, education, energy, and capacity to quench this thirst themselves, brewing their own concoction of interspiritual or integral draft. Even if they succeed, will it be the right taste for another? And how even would we find the others who have just the same preferences? I come across so many who are exhausted from this search and seem to feel as if they don't quite belong in any of the new spaces. Parts of this and parts of that, but no holistic resonance. I won't go too much into the effects of specialization and individualism, the good and the bad of which are both ever present and we should always be aware of in ourselves and the work we create. But I think one of the key questions for the religion of tomorrow is, what are the gathering principles that will draw people together in meaningful and lasting ways? We all have a deep need for belonging, and spiritual belonging in particular. And as we evolve into greater inclusivity and expansion, we need to include the very real and human need for belonging, for healthy tribes, not tribalism, and communities of commonality and shared meaning. I'll talk a little more about this later. So this religion of the future, this new mysticism, is not separate, but is born out of and from the religion of today. Again, the tensions between bridge building and pioneering, transcending and including, differentiating and reintegrating, We need to accept this tension and learn to live in it if we want to be healthy evolvers, if we want a religion of tomorrow that is not bypassing nor stuck in reactionary energy. And we hold that tension in each of the 4 quadrants. This is not the same as the dissonance, but rather that the movement toward a healthy resonance will always involve tension, creative tension, and painful birthing tension. It will also need to manifest in each of the quadrants. In other words, working toward the tetra rising of the religion of tomorrow. In my work, this focuses on the emergence coming mostly within the common language and expression of Christian spirituality, with many integrations from other paths too. Even if you are not coming from this tradition, hopefully you will find some application for your own context. At the very least, we can probably all recognize some personal connection if you come from Western society. So I warmly invite all of you to keep listening. Even if Christianity is not your native spiritual tongue, we can probably all speak a fair amount of the language from our cultural tongue and its interfusion with Christianity. So I want to go through and spend a little time exploring each of the quadrants. But before I do that, I want us to move into a little guided practice. This might seem a little jarring if you're listening in your receptive mind, taking in information I'm sharing with you. But I want to do this for a few reasons. First, because I want us to move from our consciousness of receptivity to a consciousness of participation. I want this exploration to have a degree of generativity for you and for me, possibly. I want you to feel the freedom to engage and bring your own creativity and arisings into this space, perhaps even pausing at times to speak or write your own thoughts, contributions, or applications. And secondly, because I very much want to move us beyond the consciousness of the mind alone. At Integral Christian Network, we practice embodied mysticism in the participatory tradition. We believe to move into the consciousness that is necessary for the path ahead, that we need to move beyond our minds and embrace the knowing of our entire body. I'll talk more about that later, but now I want to try to move myself and all of us more into the deeper and fuller consciousness of our whole being. So I'm going to guide us in a brief whole body mystical awakening meditative prayer practice, which is our core practice, and see if you notice a shift in your consciousness and how you're engaging with the rest of this time. And I very much encourage you not to just skip ahead, because this is important. So take a few deep breaths, settle into your presence in the space where you are now. And allow your attention to move to your heart space. Feel the air moving around your heart. Perhaps the rising of energy. If you need help moving from your head to your heart, you can always tap down from your head. Perhaps place both your hands over your heart, as your arms and hands are part of your heart space. You can also think about someone you love if you need to get those loving feelings flowing. And then when you feel the energy, just release that person and stay in your heart. And then sink down even further into the deep heart, into the radiant center of love and bliss. Now move your attention to your feet. Ground yourself into the earth with your feet. Maybe you need to wiggle your toes or stamp your feet a few times. And just imagine roots growing from the bottom of your feet down into the earth, connecting you to the energy field of the earth, the energy of material reality. And you can breathe that up into your body, up through your feet and into your legs. now move to your spiritual womb, your gut space. You might put your hands over your belly. This is the space of our identity, of creativity and courage. And deeper within our divine being. So let yourself just rest in your spiritual womb, in the divine embrace of the ground of your being. Keeping your grounding and your presence in your womb, touch base with the radiant center of your heart. As we move up to our head and coming from the energy of our body, we often find that our mind is unusually cleared. And there's a vibrant stillness that we can simply rest in, or be open to receiving images or thoughts or words, even smells or sounds coming from our deeper self. And from our whole being, from our body, just return to this space, to this video, and be present with your whole being, participating, receiving, and engaging. So let's start in the upper right quadrant. As we've just spent a little time in each of those centers in the practice, you hopefully have somewhat of an experiential, felt sense of the development of our understanding of our bodies. Here we've integrated teachings from a wide variety of traditions, with particular application from the practice of embodied spiritual inquiry and the participatory approach, following Jorge Ferrer, who was interviewed for this series on episode 13. You may also recognize a similarity and coherence to the three centers Sean Aisburn-Hargens emphasizes, which you can hear more about in episode 25. So I won't spend too much time here, as I can't say it much better than those two have. And I need to say that almost the entirety of the research and development of our framework was done by Paul Smith, so credit where credit is due. But I will offer two distinctions that we have decided to emphasize regarding the exterior or the subtle body of the individual. The first is choosing to refer to our gut or hara space as the spiritual womb. We all have a spiritual womb, whether we have a physical one or not. And we all need a little bit more feminine integration in our spiritual lives, especially Christians. But beyond that, we see this space as a source of generativity, the seed of courage and creativity, and the wellspring of new life. We think the womb is the organ that best represents that symbolically. We also include the feet as a center for spiritual knowing, following embodied spiritual inquiry, rather than just the three torso centers. The feet are our contact point to the earth, where we can ground ourselves in presence and the energy of material reality. In this way, our feet serve as the connection point to our whole bodies on a somatic, even cellular level. I'll talk more about both of these centers as we move into the upper left quadrant, but before I do that, I want to offer a connection in the Christian context to both of these centers. At the end of a festival, Jesus said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink, and rivers of living water will flow from your innermost being." The word in Greek there for innermost being is actually womb, though all of the translators, the vast majority of which have almost certainly been male, were too squeamish to use the word, instead opting for innermost being or sometimes belly. No, from our womb. Christianity is the religion of incarnation, of God made flesh. It is one of the reasons why we place such an emphasis on the embodied part of our approach. Yet historically, this hasn't been practiced all too well, to say the least. It was most often put off on Jesus alone as the only incarnation. But a Christianity of tomorrow should embrace and claim the goodness, even the divinity of our own physical being. This is the God within, the panentheism, God in all things. Yes, this is important. Before we move to the upper left quadrant, we should talk about the three faces of God, the divine reflection of each of the quadrants, so to speak. I'll also talk about how we pray to a three-faced God, or what we've started calling integral prayer. Here again, drawing on Wilbur, of course, I follow the language from Paul Smith of the three faces, while I've articulated these three movements of prayer. In the third person, object nature of God, we have the infinite face of God beyond us, the cosmic God big enough for our minds, the infinite mystery that is always expanding and drawing us onward. This is the mystery that is not unknowable, but is infinitely knowable. In an integral form of prayer to this face of God, we wouldn't pray at this mythic God in the sky, like throwing a message in a bottle out to sea with no real expectation of response. But rather, we make the movement of prayer into the beyond, into transcendence. We can actually make this transcendent movement of prayer in each of our four centers, head, heart, womb, and feet, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. The second person, you, or I, thou nature of God, we have the intimate face of God beside us. This is the personal God who is close enough for our hearts. This is often a strength of Christianity, offered so clearly in the person of Jesus. But it has also become something left behind for many Christians who have had to evolve beyond the traditional stage. It can sometimes be hard to reintegrate and rediscover a fresh face for Jesus beyond the baggage of the traditional stage, buddy Jesus. So it's often important for Christians and those from other traditions to recognize this second person face of God in other personal forms of spirit, in spiritual guides and other divine forms. This can also be a difficult integration, overcoming the materialist rationalist skepticism and the pre-trans fallacy of magical thinking. Many in progressive spiritual circles are more comfortable with the divine as the great impersonal all, or the energy within all things. You can share that you've had an experience of oceanic oneness with the depth of all being, transcending into the vast divine embrace of all things, but don't dare to say that you've had a conversation with Jesus. That is the movement of this prayer, to go from praying to Jesus or a personal form of God to actually praying with them, speaking and listening, sitting in the silence of one another's presence, being guided by them. The living Jesus is certainly one of my primary guides, but I have another primary second-person face of spirit come to me in the form of Danu, the Celtic goddess of creation, water, motherhood. I have needed this feminine integration, this generative and creative guidance, and it was helpful that it came from a figure outside of my Christian tradition, free of any baggage or preconceived associations. Still, though, if that's too difficult or sounds a little woo-woo for you, you can always find the second-person face of God in a flesh and bones person in your life, because we are all, in our essence, divine beings. It can just sometimes be harder to find an ascended master in the flesh. Speaking of our inner divinity, for the first-person face of God, we have the inner or incarnate face of God being us. This is the God us enough for our own deepest identities, or we might say for our wombs. The path to identification as our own divine being is at the heart of many contemplative traditions, and is very much in the Christian tradition as well, though it usually had to be veiled or hidden from the authoritarian hierarchies. This is often a very difficult and lifelong journey to come to this identification. And just for clarity's sake, it is not us becoming God, an ego movement, but God being us. But in integral prayer, we even take it one step further. We don't just identify as divine, but actually seek to participate in our divine nature, a phrase from 1 Peter in the Bible. To do this, we need to move into a state of awakened consciousness, which leads us well into our upper left quadrant, the interior experience of the individual. So you get a sense of the movements of an integral approach to Christian mysticism. In this sense, mysticism is not just an interior individual movement, but let's go ahead and talk about mysticism a little more directly here. As we believe mysticism is crucial for the religion of tomorrow and is absolutely central to our work, let me give you a few orienting generalizations about mysticism and how we approach it at ICN. A mystic is someone who engages in the direct experience of the divine, number one. Number two, this is often in the form of felt sensations, impressions, visions, inner words, and conversation, experienced in any or all of our embodied centers of spiritual knowing. Number three, mystical experience can be transcendent, intimately relational, and/or deeply personal within. You can hear how each of those orienting generalizations touch into mystical experience with each of the three faces of God. So we're not talking only about a connection to an external or mythic God, of course. In emphasizing mysticism, we take a developmental approach and therefore place a lot of emphasis on spiritual practice, not just mental theories or ideas. At Integral Christian Network, we are practitioners operating within the context of life, not removed from the world in monastic contexts from which much of the contemplative tradition has come. As such, our practice needs to reflect this context and look a little different, but we also have to do it. This is the path of our development. It is an approach of empowerment for Christians who have very often spent most of their lives in a religious context of passivity, listening to the sermon or simply receiving communion rather than participating in it. It is also an entry point of engagement for those who've been very much trapped in the mind through belief systems. Often they are craving personal experience in a way to integrate a more mystical, spiritual approach to their faith. So we seek to develop our consciousness through the practice of whole body mystical awakening, a short form of which we just did. This is a practice designed specifically to facilitate the awakening of a deeper knowing, even a divine knowing, if we might dare to claim that, though not in an authoritative way. Our practice leads a person through each of the four centers, beginning with an entry state, moving into a knowing state, and sometimes into a unified or transcendent state, which we didn't do earlier. You might recognize how these states have some parallels to low subtle, high subtle, and causal states, with some different language and emphasis for a Christian context. Since you already experienced a form of this, provided you didn't skip ahead, I'll just name a little of the process of moving through the states in this practice. We always start with the heart because it is the center of love and human reality. In the heart, we are moving into the energy of love. This deep love is also the heart of our divine consciousness, for God is love. Beginning in our heart also gets us out of the trappings of our head most easily. In our entry state, we drop our attention down into the heart and the energy of the flow of love. There are a few ways we can help activate or generate this energy, just like we did in the practice. Then we move into the knowing state by awakening to our awareness from the radiant center in the deep heart, the core of our hearts, emanating love and bliss. In the transcendent unified state, we discover the bliss in our hearts is already enfolding everything and everyone. We move into the universal communion of embracing all. When we move to sensing from our feet, we are welcoming the material reality of our body and the earth. We are moving into the embodied energy of our physical being, of our skin and bones, of our very cells. In the entry state, we ground ourselves to this deeper physical presence in this time and place, where we are now in our lives. We use the earth to help us in this rooting to the moment, keeping us oriented to our imminent presence. The earth is also a source of energy for our bodies, with a powerful energetic field in which we can tap into. As we move into the knowing state from our feet, we begin to move into the felt sense of our incarnated entanglement. This is the experience that we are not separate from material reality. We are a part of it. We can feel the energy of deep intertwining in the very fibers of our cells. This is knowing from our interbeing. In the unified state from our feet, from our physical being, we are moving into the great web, the experience of participation in the seamless materiality of embodying all. Moving to awareness from our womb is to move to the ground of our being, to the seat of our unique self and our divine reality. In the entry state, we seek We sink down into this space in an act of vital centering, letting ourselves rest in the flowing embrace of generativity. It is a release into simply being. In the knowing state, we begin to sense the arisings from the divine wellspring. These appear in the form of intuitions or the sensations of creativity or courage. In the unified state of our womb, we sink down further within, into the primordial darkness of the deep, the space of singularity before manifestation. This is the movement into source oneness, being all. Our heads, we're probably most familiar with being aware from there, but of course often this space is filled with the tyrannical chatter of our busy minds. So for our entry state, we need to clear the mind. While many meditation techniques essentially try to use the mind to still the mind, we have found that moving down into the energy of the heart, the radiant love and bliss, and then returning to the mind yields a surprisingly clear and vibrant stillness, engaging the energy of the whole body even more. Here, many practices want to simply remain in the stillness or ascend to transcendence. Both of those are perfectly fine, but the knowing state in our heads is the place of awareness to the arisings of visionary knowing, which we welcome. This is a sight or perception of the invisible world. These often come in the form of images, words, thoughts, and even smells or sounds. They have a different quality and feel than our usual thoughts. They are also not under our control like the imagination. They arise from this deeper state of knowing. In the unified state, we expand into the infinite vastness, into transcendence. We are seeing from the reality of the great cosmic witness, beyond all. That's the fullness of whole body mystical awakening as we've discovered so far. We believe it is the most integral practice available for Christians today, and not just Christians too, anyone can practice it. As I mentioned before, we very much follow Ferrer in the practice as a form of embodiment, seeking awareness from each of our centers. This is embodied participatory mysticism, expanding our consciousness in a more holistic, integrated way. We also draw the three forms of reality from Ramon Panikkar, human, divine, material, as we found it resonates with the movements and spaces in our practice, not as separate realities, but deeply interconnected. And we place special emphasis on the subtle states of spiritual knowing, which I should probably say a little more about. Much of the Christian contemplative tradition today places special emphasis on the witness state, seeking to move to a particular expression or experience of non-duality. While this is very much a worthy aim, to say the least, in truth, it is probably beyond the reach of the vast majority of people on Earth, not because of interior lack of ability, but more so because of external circumstances and the systems and structures of modern life, as well as the access to communities and support for such an endeavor. While the subtle realm often gets swallowed in the pre-trans fallacy, and its abuses and misunderstandings abound, we believe that we must play with that fire, so to speak. We will do our best to do everything we can not to get burned or to burn others through shadow work, community accountability, transparency, humility, and love. But we're going to need the subtle energies of the body for the times coming ahead. Our inner resources are already severely lacking in much of the world today. What will happen under further stress, collapse, and death? We are going to need higher wisdom and guidance. We will need spiritual guides and deeper ways of knowing and being. In short, we will need the best consciousness that manifests in form. We need that available to us. And lastly, engaging in the subtle realm is really helpful to do with a shared context of meaning and form. Wilber talks about this, how the subtle realm often manifests in a specific form that really ties us into our tradition. If I'm connecting with Jesus and you are communing with Kali, we can welcome that for one another, but it will be much more difficult to have a shared experience of meaning and connection without that similar native tongue and understanding, or shared stories of cultural and religious context. And this leads us to the lower left quadrant, the interior of the collective. We can't do this alone, or rather, we can only go so far by ourselves. Our primary form of gathering in Integral Christian Network is not structured around teaching or learning, but collective practice in our form of mystical we space. Using whole body mystical awakening and integral prayer, we are seeking to enter into the collective, primarily from our awakened state. Though it's almost always an aspirational experiment, but perhaps less often than you might think. We're able to touch that place at least once in every group I've ever been a part of. Part of the reason for that is the energy of the collective has a heightening effect. It actually draws us more easily into the field. It expands our own individual capacity simply by being immersed in the intentional, loving energy of the we. Rather than gathering primarily around our sensitive selves or even the intention of accessing higher collective wisdom, we gather from the space of love. Not just a mutual awareness, but a movement into the we space from each of our centers. This is a mystical or subtle state we space. I think here there's a vital dynamic for our earlier question about gathering principles. As long as we try to gather around something that is most primarily defined by the mind or oriented around a specific mental understanding, there will continue to be more and more conflict and separation as complexification increases. Our principle of inclusivity in tandem with this complexity, I believe, will not be one of shared mutual cognitive understanding. It will be more embodied, more experiential. To draw together in meaningful and lasting ways, we must have devotion and the surge of generativity, not just from within each individual, for that source then will be much more likely to simply follow its own impulses, but from the collective heart, collective womb, collective body. This could also be called the body of Christ. Christ being the Christian symbol for the interfusion of divine, human, and material reality, not as a tribal or competing kingdom or church, but as the empowered collective that lovingly gives itself for the world. This is we space as a community of empowerment for awakening in service to the world. This is a development from the common Christian shared spaces that are largely much more shoulder to shoulder, as the vast majority of church experiences today still have all but a few sit side by side in pews or chairs, passively receiving the service or going through a rigid prescribed liturgy. There is very little we space or heart-to-heart shared connection, let alone interpersonal spiritual awakening. Though the Christian tradition has a wide breadth of expression, so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. Our we spaces are communities of practice, with emphasis given to the communal context. The groups stay together for as long as they desire, deepening in interpersonal connection as well as spiritual growth. This ongoing relational support and encouragement is really vital for a sustaining we space experience that goes beyond the novelty of a collective experience that we can simply add to our ego belt of spiritual experiences that all too often end up being primarily in service to oneself. I believe it's so vital in a Christian context or otherwise to really harness the energy of the we, bringing people together in what Teilhard refers to as radial energy. This is the energy of evolution into new and higher forms. Far too often we are satisfied to dwell in the space of tangential energy, the energy of others who are operating at the same general frequency as ourselves. This is preaching to the choir we find in so many settings, especially in our online bubbles. Radial energy is that which pulls us forward into greater complexity and consciousness through a mutual centricity. A quote from Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan. Life had moved another step beyond the networking of free energy transfer to the synergy of symbiosis. Separate organisms blended together, creating new wholes that were greater than the sum of their parts. This was spoken about bacteria, but it is the creative pattern of evolution. Or as Fritjof Capra says it, symbiosis is a major evolutionary force with profound philosophical implications. Life is much less a competitive struggle for survival than a triumph of cooperation and creativity. And what would it look like for our we spaces, our collective gatherings, to be marked by the triumph of cooperation and creativity? And finally, moving to the lower right quadrant, the exterior of our collective spaces. In the Christian context, most of the systems and structures of church gatherings are hundreds of years old. We're still gathering in forms that were created to serve a very different culture and society. Not to mention that we're also often crafted with different motives or goals, not always of the most empowering kind, to put it nicely. So why are we still gathering in this way? Is it just simply inertia? Perhaps that is some of it. Institutions don't lend themselves well to evolution. But why haven't we created more novel and empowering forms? As anyone who has done systems work knows, it's really, really hard. But we have some new tools these days with the internet and various forms of connections. Though I will say we better ask the same questions of our spaces today as we do of the old churches. Why was this digital space designed the way it has been? And what goals and motivations are behind it? I think about that a lot when I use Facebook, and I long for better tools and better crafted spaces of digital architecture. The benefit of Facebook, of course, is that a whole lot of people are already there. Of course, we're still in the infancy of social media, and hopefully more spaces will continue to emerge that better serve different goals. We'll probably have to create some of them. Younger generations have largely already moved on from Facebook to new platforms with different goals. We use Zoom for our WeSpace groups, which has its benefits and its drawbacks, though the way you use a space also impacts its effects. Our gatherings create a very different feel to the setting than, say, a business meeting, of course. But the structure and architecture will always have its effects. This is also where religion comes in, because it is a great gathering hall. So many people are already there. It is a uniting principle that brings people together under a shared roof, so to speak. I'm also a gatherer, and I recognize the deep need that we all have for meaningful communities of depth and support, for spaces that empower generative development through co-creation and collaboration into novel emergence for greater life and love. I'm always wanting to be cognizant of finding better structures and systems to support these goals and motivations. There was a series of studies recently that came out of Harvard Divinity School called How We Gather. It was about how younger generations are trying to find new spaces for community as the traditional ones like church and such fall more by the wayside. Many of them were fused with business forms, yay, capitalism, like Soul Cycle or CrossFit. Some were just spaces of healing, like the dinner party. They identified several common values that mark a lot of these forms, and really, they're not too different from what most of us want out of community: personal and social transformation, purpose finding, creativity, and accountability. Our organizations, spaces, and gathering forms should reflect the values we want to enact. For an integral context, we can draw on spiral dynamics and the recognition of networks for the evolution into second-tier development. These also need to integrate healthy postmodern green expressions of smaller gatherings like WeSpace or Circling. Integral Christian Network hopes to be just such a network, weaving and interconnecting different nodes of generativity, supporting the emergence of life where it grows, with the flexibility to adapt and share knowledge where it is needed, creating connections of support and collaboration for the evolution into the future of Christianity, and even to the broader religion of tomorrow. We hope too that our network would be a node in a larger network of spiritual and cultural evolution, in the network of integral arising forth as a pathway for the direction ahead. If you consider yourself a part of this larger network, I hope you would feel more than welcome to connect with me in the future, if ever your work could serve or be served by a pathway of interconnection between us. I had a vision shortly before starting this work. I was on the backside of a mountain overlooking the landscape ahead. To my right, I saw the vast, empty desert, a pathway of denial and removal, the ascetic retreat from the world. There was a time I was more drawn to that path, but it wasn't for me. On the left was a vast thicket, an overgrowth of tangled brush and thorny branches, the systems of the world, religious and otherwise. There was no pathway, but I could see a few circular enclaves with small fires tending to themselves in the enclosures they had carved out. Part of me wanted to join such a space, to feel the warmth and settle into a comforting spot. But the beyond beckoned, and the pathways were not there. They needed to be carved out, pioneering ahead while keeping the overgrowth held back, building the bridges for others to cross behind. I was not alone in this forging ahead. No, most certainly not. Were you there too?